You're listening to Cultivation Elevated, hosted by Michael Williamson and Anders Peterson, where we discuss vertical farming and the future of cannabis and food production.
Welcome back to Cultivation Elevated, powered by Pipp Horticulture, where we explore the science, strategy, and systems shaping commercial cannabis cultivation today. I'm Michael Williamson, and I'm joined here by Anders Peterson. And today's topic hits right at the heart of product production quality. The final 2 or 3 weeks before harvest, we're digging into the finishing techniques, how light, nutrients, environment, and subtle stressors can make or break both yield and quality in cannabis production. Anders, I'm excited about this talk. I did a little bit of research and we've been talking about this for a while, but it seems like we cannot really start this conversation without talking and defining what senescence is, because we're going to be talking around senescence for most of the day. And so I guess in the simplest format, senescence is when the plant transitions from vegetative energy use to biochemical refinement, and it's mobilizing sugars and nutrients to the flowers. A more scientific definition would be that senescence is the natural genetically programmed aging process in the plants. And this is a stage where a plant begins to reallocate its internal resources. So again, nutrients, carbohydrates, and energy away from the growth and towards reproduction and survival function. So in simpler terms, it's the plant's biological wind down phase. But in cannabis, it's also when some of the most valuable chemistry happens.
Yeah, I like to think of the natural life cycle of cannabis outdoors and how it's a short day annual and what is occurring in the seasons. And, I live in Northern California, so I think of the weather and the seasons change up in Humboldt, Mendocino, Trinity counties, and what's happening during, this time of the year. We're in October, it's Croptober right now. The days are getting shorter, the nights are getting cooler. And the life cycle, the natural outdoor life cycle of the plant, it's starting to signal its end of life. And so what is the purpose of these plants? It's trying to reproduce. That's what their natural life cycle is, right? So they're starting to wind down and senesce and get ready to drop seed. And they're putting all those resources into those reproductive organs and those secondary metabolites. And the climate and the short days are influencing all this metabolism. I like to think of this phase as kind of like grandma mode, So it's like, for example, feeding a cannabis plant or growing a cannabis plant in veg or early flower, that's almost like teenage full adult mode. And so they're going to eat a lot. They're going to take a lot of light. They have a ton of energy, but you really want to taper that down towards the end and kind of match that age of the plant and what it wants to have. It's not going to take the highest DC or the highest PPFD in weeks 8 and 9. You don't need to provide that either. It's a waste of resources because this plant is starting to taper down, like you said. This is a critical point. I think you've done all the hard work essentially, and now it's about refinement, like not intervention. And the last few weeks of flower can kind of make or break it. So I think it's important to end strong. You've done so much work to get here that you don't want to drop the ball this late in the game. So these finishing strategies and these finishing techniques are worth talking about because they can have a huge influence in your final product quality. Maybe less so yield, but I think quality and secondary metabolite production. Because right as we go into this senescence, we've already gone through that kind of swelling phase and that flower set, and we've eked out, I would say, the largest proportion of that yield. Maybe we can gain a little bit more towards the end, but really what we're focusing on is as this plant starts to taper down and senesce is bringing out those quality metrics, color, cannabinoid profile, terpene profiles, things like that.
Yeah. And, you highlighted it, like nature's kind of perfect in that way, but in the natural world, like senescence happens due to it's just the environment around it and it triggers at the right time. We talk about senescence and why it matters in CEA. It's a whole different animal because if you go too early, you'll have incomplete terpene or cannabinoid expression. And if you're too early as well, I do see that you could have yield loss. If you're too late, you have terpene volatilization, trichome oxidation, and even potency drop. And so it's really about managing senescence to maximize chemical quality and smooth burn characteristics as well. and I stole this from someone else, but I think it's really solid. Um, in its simple form, senescence is not the plant dying, it's the plant perfecting what it's built. And your goal as a cultivator is to guide senescence, not delay or accelerate it unnaturally.
Hmm.
So we're going to talk now that we've talked about senescence and kind of set the stage for some of the things we're going to be talking about today. Yeah, let's kind of dive in. I know, Anders, I think you want to kick us off on our kind of first segment.
Well, one of the questions I wanted to kind of toss your way as we start is, have you ever seen like a great grower, ruin a run in the final few weeks? And if so, what happened?
Yeah, that's a great question. I've seen growers basically not manipulate anything. So there is no wind down. So it's just kind of like push, push, push. And in some of those cases, you can see like the quality of the buds maybe isn't there. Maybe it's too much light intensity towards late stage. You start to see the actual structure of itself kind of fall apart a little bit as well. You might see crowning. We've even seen kind of late stage pistil development, depending on what kind of cues are being sent from an irrigation standpoint. Um, but yeah, it's it's interesting that everybody has like a different definition of like quote unquote flushing and what that means to them. And some people are really adamant that it's critically important, and other people are like, I don't do it, or they do it very minimally, or they do it very strategically in like a lower EC format and stuff like that. So, these last 2 or 3 weeks, if we had 12 growers in the room, you'd probably get at least 6 to 8 different answers on
Sure.
kind of what finishing a plant means.
What
But
does it
yeah, I've
mean?
seen.
What does it
Go
mean to
ahead.
you when you were looking at a crop? I would say, before I ask you this question, I would say in today's market, especially with indoor cannabis cultivation, we often see growers harvesting prematurely, more often than letting crops go too long. I think 10, 20 years ago, we saw the opposite. We saw a lot of people taking crops a little too long, and you get some of that oxidation and you get some of that, that they needed to harvest a little bit earlier. They let it go too long. Nowadays, it's the opposite. I think we see a lot of people harvesting a little bit before the crop is fully matured, just due to timelines and harvest schedules indoors. But if you were looking in a room to say, and you had the flexibility to vary your harvest day, what are you looking for? How do you define a finished flower and say, okay, it's ready to harvest?
Yeah, I mean, I guess you can almost go back to the way that we used to do things. If it's probably the easiest universal thing for anyone, whether it's a home grow or a commercial grower, is really scoping trichomes, to your point earlier. It's a good universal indicator of kind of where you're at. And I would agree, we hear more commercial facilities running 8 and 9 week cycles and harvesting at 8 or 9 weeks versus a lot of those cultivars want to go 10, but they're just not doing it. And so, yes, maybe you're capturing a higher terpene profile by maybe getting that week in early, but your cannabinoid profile might not be quite hitting its kind of apex or pinnacle. Um, I can't remember what question you asked. What question did you ask?
How do you define a finished flower? Like, what are you looking for to
Hmm.
say, okay, I think your comment on trichome scoping is definitely a common one that we've used for a long time in this industry. And for those who are unfamiliar with it, when you look at trichomes under an eye loop or a microscope as the plant is still growing, trichomes typically begin quite clear when you look at them. Then they start to get somewhat milky, and then they amber out as they age. And so over the years, a lot of growers have debated this kind of milky to amber to clear ratio as how they define what a finished flower is. I think most people target mostly milky trichomes with some amber and some clear. So they're kind of finishing in the middle. On top of that, I think we also look at pistil senescence too. The pistils are typically starting out very white and fresh and vegetative, and then they will also start to desiccate and dry out and senesce into amber dried pistils. So we want to see, mature pistils, milky kind of cloudy trichomes without new revegetative growth. So one of the things we don't want to see is new pistil growth that's fresh and white at the end of the cycle, right? Because that's telling you we've been sending too many vegetative signals to the crop. So I think
Yeah.
maybe I answered the question myself
No,
after I
you
asked
did.
it
I
for
think the
you,
only other
but
thing I would add there too is like, just like take all the science and, just your visual eye as a grower, like what does a plant done look like? I think all the things you mentioned are pretty spot on. The other one too is what's happening with your fan leaves. This is a stage where it typically relocates a lot of energy from growth to refinement. So you'll see carbohydrates moving from leaves and stems into flowers, and the chlorophyll start breaking down, and secondary metabolites like cannabinoids and terpenes start to peak. So that's kind of another element we're looking at, commonly referred to as the fade. Um, and so, what's really happening there is that carbon partitioning shift. Photosynthase flow is redirecting towards resin glands. At the same time, pigments like anthocyanin and carotenoids, am I saying that right?
Yeah.
Carotenoids? A hard one for me. Build up as part of the plant's photoprotective response. And so that's the other kind of thing when I'm looking at a whole crop, like, is this crop done? But it's kind of all those things. But I think at the heart of it is the trichome. And everyone's a little bit different on kind of what they consider to be done. I remember, as you were highlighting, I think historically, like about 10, 15 years ago, it was all about amber trichomes. We were taking stuff pretty far down the line. And people are harvesting earlier for different reasons. They might be willing to take a slight yield loss for better terpene profile. Maybe they're going to be fresh freezing and washing it, so they're really focused there. Or maybe they have cultivars that are just really, they're pushing big yields, so they're more susceptible to botrytis in late stage is another reason I see people harvesting early. So, um,
Hmm.
yeah, those are kind of, I think, some of the drivers that are decision making. But to reiterate, I think the trichome is kind of the nucleus of everything that we're looking at as well. And as you know, in cannabis, it's never one thing. It's usually a collection or archipelago of things that you're looking at and then trying to drive decision making.
Yeah. So I wonder if we could shift the conversation to so that we've touched on really what the we're looking at from a plant perspective, but as a grower, what can we influence and what can we do to help that ripening and senescence? What can we touch? And so in terms of environmental and root zone cues and how we can adjust those parameters to help facilitate that senescence. Generally, I would say we're tapering, right?
Yeah.
As we're finishing. So we're tapering all the parameters. We're not pushing the max light intensity. We're starting to taper that light intensity down, just like it does outside in its natural habitat. We're tapering down the CO2 supplementation rate, maybe not to atmospheric levels like 450, but maybe down from 1400 to say 650 towards the end. We are dropping the temperature and the humidity and therefore raising the VPD typically is how that's going. And so temperature is definitely a huge factor in the senescence and ripening phase for a lot of these quality aspects, not only terpene expression and retention of those terpenes, because if you're finishing a room at 80 plus degrees, those terpenes are so volatile, especially mono and diterpenes, that they're going to volatilize at room temp. So by keeping that grow room cooler during the end of the cycle, we'll preserve more of those terpenes throughout the finishing period and then into dry. But
Do you
secondarily,
want
that
to quantify that for people? I know it's a little bit different. Some people really like to freeze their rooms out. I'm not in that camp. I'm typically in that 3 to 5 degrees less during that last week. But I guess where's that sweet spot for you?
so what I always challenge growers to do is to, because the balance of that temperature set point is people are wanting to encourage color and fade, bringing out those purple and color characteristics of the flower. But from a business perspective indoors, the colder you want and drier you want to run your room, the more costly it is. And that adds costs to your run and your cogs. So I think it's always good as a grower to challenge yourself. How can I ripen and get those quality characteristics at as warm of a temperature as possible? Right. So I'm
And
in the
within
same
what your system can actually do as well. There's kind of where
it
you
can
want to go,
achieve.
but you're going to have the limitations of what your HVAC will actually allow you to do.
And certain cultivars will respond differently. Like I just saw a lemon cherry pheno that someone hunted from seed the other day that was purpling out already in week 5, 6. And it was going to continue to purple even at that warmer temperature. Anthocyanins, a temperature dependent protein, which is what is providing that purple color. And different cultivars, that protein has is more temperature stable or less. And people refer to that as phenotypic plasticity. And so phenotypic plasticity is the ability for the environment to affect a phenotype. So it's a genotype by environment interaction. Certain genes or traits are more plastic than others. So meaning the environment can have more or less of an influence on a trait. And it just turns out that anthocyanin and pigmentation is a pretty plastic trait. So that protein can be affected at different temperatures under different cultivars. That's an important thing to kind of note. I would say generally, I'm trying to taper down to low 70s. I'm not one to get into the 60s in flower. I would say generally
Are you
humidity.
referencing daytime or nighttime temps?
Good question. That's another good topic of discussion is day to night diffs when finishing, but I was referencing daytime.
Mhm.
And then in humidity, that lower threshold very much depends upon your mechanical system's ability to maintain that set point. So, but generally 55% is a kind of a range. 50 to 55% is kind of the lowest I would go. But yeah, day to night, that's a great topic. There's a lot of benefit of increasing the day to night differential in terms of quality, especially because that's how it happens outdoors this time of year. You have a pretty big difference in temperature from daytime to nighttime. However, if your room cannot control these big fluctuations and swings, you also increase your risk of mold and botrytis, having a big day to night differential at the end of the cycle. So I've always had a not a neutral day to night temperature set point, but a very moderate drop in temperature and conditions between day to night. I think when you get too aggressive, let's say 8 to 10 degrees different from day to night, that's when maybe there is some benefit quality, but you run a really high risk of botrytis and mold.
Well, one of the other things too, and this is like more of a personal rant, but look, there's purple cultivars that are purple in any temperature. You know, your GDPs, your purple Urkel. Trying to think of some other ones that but you know what I'm talking about. Like when
Black
you
Domina,
in black. Do you say black domino?
yeah,
Oh man, I haven't heard that one in a while. It's all Dutch stuff. But when you crack it open and you look inside, I mean, it's almost like it finishes black. Like it is purple all the way through, like the old purple Kush. So when I think of like people trying to bring out color, yeah, maybe you get a little bit of purple hues on the bud itself, but it seems like a lot of the purple is really in the fan leaves. And like by the time it goes through trimming and everything, all these purple that people are trying to force on a cultivar that doesn't naturally want to be that purple, I just don't see that the value is there. And I could be wrong. And I know there's like micro niches in each market and different demands and buyers just want to see a little hue here and there. But when you tell me you got some purple weed, I want to crack it open and I want to see that purple running deep throughout that bud. So
sure.
sometimes some of these things that people do to, bring out the anthocyanin further, I think it's neat and novel, but I'd rather just be working with like a true purple cultivar, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, yeah, I think a lot of people are trying to force it because of the bag appeal from the buyers. The buyers want it, but I'm not a huge fan of packs. When you open up a pack and you see just like streaks of purple throughout it, or you see
It's like
some buds.
flaky.
Yeah, you see some buds really purpled, but a lot of the buds are still green. It's like they really tried to force it. And what did they sacrifice trying to chase that color in terms of cost and yield and a number of other things? Because if you start dropping those temps too early, photosynthesis is also a temperature dependent process. So your plant is going to be less productive the cooler you get that room. And so you can sacrifice other things chasing that purple when maybe those cultivars just are not the right candidate to be doing that.
Yep. I guess to bring it back to DLI for a minute, just to give people some kind of general range, for those last couple weeks, we're typically reducing DLI by maybe it's only 10% the first week as we start to taper down, but then maybe 20%, usually not 30%, but it kind of fluctuates by cultivar. But I would say 10 to 25% reduction of light the last couple weeks to prevent like photo-oxidative stress, but still gives enough photons for resin production. There's a balance there. So you don't want to just like slam a bunch of light. It's just like anything else. Like we don't just slam light in the beginning, we titrate up. we titrate down. So there is a
Hmm.
strategic curve there. And depending on your varieties and how you run your room and your style and what your goals are, your curves can all be a little bit different. And then not all cultivators have this ability, but some of the cultivators that have like LED lights that where you can manipulate spectrum, they'll start to shift the light spectrum slightly towards the end. So if they have the ability to, they might go leaning towards red or far red to promote, more of that kind of purple and round out some of the cannabinoid profile as well.
Hmm. What about
Can
the root
we,
zone?
well, before we do that, we'll
Okay.
get there. I know that's one of your favorite zones. Um, uh, Probably no one else likes our jokes. Hopefully, someone out there is nerdy too. But I want to talk about the famous or infamous 48-hour dark period
Mm.
because I went to try and find a bunch of white papers to support it so that I could talk more educated about it, and I just couldn't find anything. And so my conclusion was is that the data currently shows that it doesn't boost THC, and any perceived effect usually comes from terpene retention and not increased biosynthesis. So it's more about protecting volatile compounds than it is about creating new ones. And so I know a lot of people are like, oh, I always I shut all my lights off for 24 or 48 hours before I harvest, and that I couldn't find a compelling reason to tell someone that's a great idea. I
Yeah,
was
me
curious.
either. I would agree with what you just said. I would say the only potential benefit of doing it that I could see is terpene retention. And really, by not running your lights, all you're doing is just reducing the heat. So as long as you can maintain your temperature, even if you've dimmed those lights down and titrated that light intensity down, you're also titrating the heat load in the room. And so you're also going to try and preserve terpenes that way.
That makes more sense. It's more of a temperature thing and less of a light thing.
That's what my understanding has always been. I did it when many years ago. I used to keep my rooms dark for a day and 2 days before harvest. I didn't know why I was doing it. I just did it because that's
Sure.
what everyone else did.
Same,
And then,
same. Yeah.
and then I started, becoming a little bit more. I started questioning some of those strategies and being like, "What is the point here?" And I couldn't find a good reason other than, you're just reducing the temperature. So if I can manage that temperature better, even with a less light intensity, then that's what I'll do. Because that kind of also ties into a strategy we've talked about in this podcast in the past, which is, kind of drying on the vine or dying on the vine. And especially if you have undersized dry room dehumidification capacity, you can use a lower light intensity and leverage the transpiration process while that plant is still connected to the root zone to facilitate a drying out process to get a jump start before you load all that wet weight into a dry room. So you're essentially ceasing irrigation or greatly reducing irrigation the last, let's say, 12 to 48
36.
hours. I was going to say 36 to
Ooh,
48.
48's rough.
Yeah,
We got some. I don't want to ruin anyone's crop, but I think you can go 48 hours. You better be really closely monitoring
it
that.
depends on your environment,
Yeah.
basically. But
Yeah.
so there's a spectrum there. So caution if you were to try this, you don't want to go to the wilt point, but because it makes harvesting and weaving those plants out of the trellis quite challenging. But
I do that
it-
once.
it's a valid technique, especially if you are bottlenecked in your dry room with dehumidification capacity to kind of start drying on the vine. So in that sense, you wouldn't be running no light because you need a little bit of that light for transpiration and to help encourage that drying out of the crop.
All right. So I see that we've entered the root zone part of the conversation.
That's a
But
good segue.
I guess so hitting the root zone and nutrient side, there's big misconceptions as we were talking about flushing earlier, and everyone's got a different opinion here, so bear with us. But we'd love to hear what your nutrient flushing looks like. So if you want to drop that into the notes, or not notes, comments is the word I was looking for, into the comments. We're always curious what people are doing, and it'd be nice to see if we could figure out what people are doing around the world, or hey, 40% of our listeners are doing it this way, and that kind of stuff. So feel free to engage in the comments. We love the positive, we love the negative, we like the constructive feedback. So we take it and we try and kind of change this podcast and narrative to kind of give people what they want. But So yeah, big misconception about flushing. Studies show little benefit from complete nutrient starvation. What seems to work well is again, it's all about tapering, as Anders mentioned earlier. So EC tapering, and depending on whose line you're running and what EC you're running, that could be a 50% taper, it could be less. But essentially, we're trying to make it so the plant finishes clean without really inducing any deficiency. We're also trying to maximize yield. It's a short life cycle. And so if you're like, I start flushing with straight RO water 2 weeks before, you're really starting to shortchange yourself on like yield potential, and you can create other issues that leave you susceptible to mold, mildew, and all kinds of other problems.
The myths about flushing, to kind of start taking it back a little bit. Historically, people think flushing helps strip a lot of the nutrients out of the bud and provides a better ash and burn and smokability and helps with the fade. I think anecdotally, what I noticed when people were doing straight RO flushes many years ago was their nutrient programs back then had less of the ability to pull nitrogen out.
Mm.
And so nowadays, with more knowledge, where a lot of people are running like calcium chloride, for example, versus calcium nitrate. So they're able to achieve the same thing without running zero EC or, straight RO flush. I think that's probably anecdotally why growers just like stumbled upon that was it wasn't that the straight RO was the right answer. It was the reduction in nitrogen because I personally think pushing calcium up until harvest is really important for mold prevention and just overall plant health. And so I don't want to strip everything out. I would rather slowly titrate down that root zone EC, which when we're steering generatively before harvest can be challenging. It can be challenging to get those drybacks that you're targeting in the root zone generatively without stacking your EC. So paying a really close attention to your P2s to be able to push enough runoff and get to that first drain in the day early so you can start tapering down that EC before harvest. It can be tricky.
Yeah, that
But
taper
one
naturally lowers those nitrate levels. And, as to your point, which is richly encouraging those secondary metabolisms. And I don't know, I think of it as like mild limitation and not like deprivation. I think
Yeah.
we went too extreme, years ago, and some people are still doing that as well. So it's more about controlled stress is kind of the theme, I would say. Not
Yeah, like
like
think about osmotic pressure, for example. That's when I think about this flushing and going to straight RO is where my head goes. Right? So plants uptake water via osmosis through the root zone. And a lot of that process has to do with solute concentration or EC, right? The salt concentration in your root zone solution. One of my concerns in the flushing phase, if you were to go from, even if you're at like a 2.2 drip EC, and then all of a sudden you're going to feed like a zero point 0.1 EC of just straight RO, you're changing that solute concentration in the root zone pretty extremely and pretty drastically. And so that's going to have a major effect on the osmotic pressure of the root zone and how efficiently that plant can uptake nutrients and water. And you can have the opposite effect where you can actually be dehydrating the roots by pulling water out of the roots, but with a big change in osmotic pressure, whether that's high or low EC. So instead of doing anything to the extreme, pushing a high EC or pushing basically a no EC with RO water, I think it's always smarter to meet in the middle and be gradual with cultivation and end on a tapering and a like moderate root zone EC than basically stripping it down to nothing or pushing it really high. That's why flushing has kind of always scared me as I learned more about it.
Yeah, it's too extreme of a stress. I think the
Too
theme
extreme.
today is really controlling your stress. Fine tuning is kind of where your average advanced cultivator is today. It's those little adjustments that you make that are starting to kind of add up at this point. What are some other myths that we can bust? We can,
Hmm.
we talked about cold shocking for color.
Um, I'm curious, how do you feel about plant work before harvest? How early do you start with Or do you at all? Do you start thinning out the canopy, stripping fan leaves in flower before going to dry, or are you doing it in the dry room once plants are hung?
Done both. Preference for labor cost savings would be prior to harvest. Really depends on your crew and your kind of setup. But I typically like that at the latest, or at the latest 3 days before harvest, but somewhere between 3 and maybe 7. I think 3 and 5 days before harvest is a sweet window to kind of get in there. Now, mind you, you've done a defoliation, let's just call it around day 21, give or take, after you've kind of transitioned, or right before you've transitioned into vegetative cues. And then again, in that traditional kind of 45-day, there might be a light brush up potentially. But just because those leaves have to get off there and it's easiest to do it while the plant is up, right? I wouldn't want to do like a heavy pre-harvest defoliation 10 or 14 days prior. You know, I think you can leave yourself, you leave yourself open for some risk potentially. So I would say a simple answer, 3 to 5 days prior to harvest.
Hmm.
What about you?
Same. I think it also is very dependent upon um, do you have the labor available to do that, or have you planned for it? What other
Yeah.
tasks are going on in the facility, and do you have the ability to do that strip in the flower room or remove those fan leaves in flower? Sometimes I see it both, where you basically get as much as you can, maybe the day before harvest, removing a lot of the fan leaves that are just going to encumber the drying process. Because what happens is they start to wilt and then essentially encapsulate those buds, and it prevents an even dry if you're doing a whole plant hang, if you have too many fan leaves in that room. And so removing a lot of those large fan leaves, there's no benefit of drying them in the dry room. It helps to encourage a more even dry and reduce the risk of like bud rot and mold in the dry room as well. So I think if you can get a head start on it in the flower room, that's great. Not too early. I would say within, 3 days before harvest, and then likely there'll be additional stripping in the dry room.
Yeah, and I guess, we just did our lean webinar, so just kind of that's still kind of fresh in my mind. But one of the things I'll say, kind of putting my lean hat on, is if you're like, I don't have enough people to defoliate this at the level that I want to pre-harvest, you have to look at the amount of people that you have and the tasks that you have, or the time that you have, and you got to say, okay, guys, we got 6 hours left in this day. There's this many plants, and it's a math equation. You just say, I'd rather see some defoliation happen than none, and I'd rather also not see, oh, if that even makes sense what I just said. But I'd also like to not see like, hey, we really did a good job defoliating these 2 rows, but the rest of them we weren't able to touch. So for me, I think it's more important to get like uniformity on your defoliation across all the varieties versus some and not the others. And then when I think about lean stuff and measuring, when you're defoliating on a plant, assuming that it's a average size plant, not a giant size plant, you can typically defoliate with 2 hands, and you're plucking down. And if you've got the technique, you snap the wrist and you get a clean break. You don't get the string attached or anything like that. When you're defoliating, once you've chopped the plant down and you've hung it on a Pipp Z rack or Pipp mobility rack or one of our drying carts or whatever, maybe you're on cable wires or whatever your setup is. Now you have to defoliate like this, where you pull up, and typically stuff starts to get stringy and caught. And so what ends up happening, and I know not all of you are looking at all these Italian hand gestures I have going on right now, but you end up having to hold the apical kind of stalk with one hand to create tension. Like you're holding the stalk in one hand and you're using your other hand to defoliate, and you're kind of flicking it up. And I know it seems silly, but it's not a natural wrist motion, and you get restricted to one hand instead of two. So, if I were to measure which one is more efficient, we've done this several times now. It is significantly more efficient to defoliate while it's live on the plant compared
Yeah.
to post.
I would say another big factor of like if you're going to do the stripping and when is the airflow in your room. And in finishing in general, I find airflow to be extremely important at the end of the cycle, for a number of reasons. If you have a really dense canopy and a really high yield, but you have a lack of airflow, that is typically when you start to see botrytis and bud rot in the flower room, because you have such a thick canopy. That canopy traps that moisture and can lead to those environments where mold can grow and botrytis can grow. Those higher airflow velocities will really help that. It will really help that. Also, I we're still researching this with Allison Justice over at the Cannabis Research Coalition. But I do think that these higher airflow velocities late in flower will allow you to push a bigger day to night differential without the risk of mold. Because what happens is when you're doing those big temperature drops at night, that warm air cools so quickly that it basically condenses on the plant. It's reached dew point. And so with a higher airflow velocity, that condensation is less likely to occur. So you have less of a risk of mold. So again, that airflow can provide a ton of benefits to prevent bud rot, botrytis at the end of the cycle. And so if you have poor airflow, that may be a reason to start thinning out your canopy earlier than some other people would typically have to.
Yeah, I think that's
So,
fair. That's a
so
really
hey,
good.
let me give you so recap for me, like your top three finishing kind of insights that we've talked about today as we start to wrap up. What stood out to you?
Um, Tapering. No extreme jumps in anything. So titration. No different than how we start the cycle, we end the cycle. So thinking of it as like a curve, if you will. Um, do your research on senescence. Senescence is such a fascinating concept. It's natural in the wild, and we're trying to kind of, as CEA people, there's like a godplex kind of complex thing that goes on where we want to manipulate and control everything. But I think it's important to understand what happens in nature so that we can best implement it in a controlled environment, indoor situation. Trichome maturity. I think we've gotten detached from the trichome a lot, unless you're like a solventless head or something like that. Then that's your whole life. But feels like the average grower is just not kind of. I don't see the scopes coming out these days very much. So get your scope out. We know that heads move from clear to cloudy to amber as cannabinoids oxidize and terpene profiles evolve. And I guess in short, it's all about refinement. It's not stress um, or starvation. It's just these refinements. And if you're not capturing the data and following it all the way through, you'll never really know. So a lot of growers, they grow a crop and they got eight or nine or 65 more right behind it, and they kind of lose touch with what happens to that crop. What was the THC score? What were your yields? What were the terpene profiles? What things did you do that were different? I just see a lot of people not tracking data all the way through. So that would be, I guess, the big one is if you're trying to do refinement techniques, don't just stop at harvest. You have to track that data all the way through and then articulate that data and have a conversation around it.
Oh,
What
that
about
was
you?
great. So I have one more question for you, actually, if you don't mind me
Oh,
kind of
you're
putting you
full
on
of
the
questions.
spot. I
I want to
know.
make you do the Halloween joke on the spot.
So anytime we bring up like, myths in cultivation, it always makes me think of Allison Justice because she's a colleague and a friend, and I love how she's done a lot of myth busting in the cannabis industry. If someone like Allison or another researcher was to come to you and say, "Hey, Michael, I'm really interested in studying finishing strategies and senescence in cannabis. Can you point me towards things you think I should study and research?" What would you guide that researcher towards?
Well, oh God, I think she's kind of already doing it, to be honest with you. I mean, at the end of the day, we can sit here and have all the educated opinions that we want, but what do we do this for? We do this for the end user. And in some states, that might be a medical user, or in some countries, it's a medical user. And in other countries and states, that's an adult use. But at the end of the day, it's all about how their experience is with the plant. And so I know that she was doing the science of smokability. I would kind of start there and work my way backwards. I guess I didn't really answer your question, but my answer is how does how is that experience from an inhalation standpoint and an effect standpoint for the end user? And then how do we work backwards from there
Hmm.
to understand what things and components and processes that we do that are manipulating this?
Yeah. I'd be really curious to have someone dive deeper on the interactions with ethylene gas in a flower
Mm.
room and in a dry room. For those that don't know, ethylene is considered a plant hormone, but it's used in horticulture quite a lot. For example, in the tomato industry, a lot of, those red tomatoes you see in the grocery store, they're harvested green so that they're more firm and can handle transport better. And naturally, tomatoes will put off ethylene gas to mature and bring out that red tomato color that you see and ripen. So ethylene really does encourage that ripening process. But in transport, they do is they bring these green tomatoes into a room, dose that room with ethylene gas, turn them red for that last mile to your grocery store. Ethylene is also put off by cannabis. People have been measuring it and trying to track it. I know Allison has done some work in that area, but I think it would benefit all of us to better understand the dynamics of that ethylene gas and abscisic acid towards the end of the flowering cycle, so we can better manipulate or optimize that process of ripening. If anyone's curious about this, I'll give you a simple little experiment you can do on your kitchen counter. Take a glass bowl and a banana. Take a really unripened avocado or peach or something and put that ripe banana under that glass bowl with an unripened avocado or peach. And it is shocking to see how quickly that avocado or peach will ripen, because bananas put off a very high rate of ethylene gas as they ripen. And so you can ripen your other fruits with that old banana. It's a pretty fun experiment to try at home.
Definitely.
So anyways.
Well, this episode's been fun for me. Hopefully our guests feel the same way. We're trying to do kind of a shorter format moving forward and really focusing on one hard topic versus kind of getting into a multitude. And I know with cannabis, it's a never-ending conversation. So on that note, we look forward to the next Cultivation Elevated, and thank you for listening today.
Thank you.